Hello and welcome to the next video of EKG interpretation as part of the EMS Peers YouTube channel. So in this video we're going to be talking about atrial rhythms, and just as I mentioned in the last video and how it will be in the rest of the videos, it's not going to be as complex, fortunately. Like I said, the first video is the hardest. Sinus rhythms were easier, and then atrial rhythms, for the most part, are actually even easier than sinus rhythms, at least in my opinion. So hopefully this one isn't too bad, and we'll try not to make it too long. We also aren't going to go over any of the review stuff of like electrophysiology or a little bit of physiology and anatomy, but just as it pertains to each individual rhythm. So that'll save some time too on these videos, so hopefully they start going a little bit quicker. But with all that, let's jump into atrial rhythms. So in this video we're going to talk about atrial fibrillation, and it looks like I put a space, maybe that's just the way it's written. Looks like there's a space between atrial, the A and, wow, doesn't matter, you know what I mean. So we're going to talk about atrial fibrillation, atrial flutter, multifocal atrial tachycardia, MAT is another name for that, premature atrial complex, or PAC, and wandering atrial pacemaker. So first rhythm we're going to talk about is atrial fibrillation. So the characteristics, or the morphology, the criteria of it is there will be no discernible P waves. It'll be grossly irregular. It can be considered either controlled or uncontrolled. I'm going to actually highlight that. So it can be either controlled, terrible highlighting, or uncontrolled. So it's commonly referred to as just afib instead of saying the whole thing, atrial fibrillation. Just afib works. And then the next, or the last two, it kind of jumps back to the controlled or uncontrolled. So controlled is a heart rate below 100, whereas uncontrolled is a heart rate above 100. And I think my video's in the way, so you probably can't see that, so I'll just make a note here. Uncontrolled is above 100 for heart rate. So let's talk about the physiology behind afib. So with afib, what's happening is how each individual heart cell has automaticity, which is its ability to generate its own electrical impulse without any other stimuli. We have this rapid firing of different pacemakers, or different individual cells trying to take over as the pacemaker, but what happens is, if you think about the process of depolarization and repolarization, which I don't know if I discussed that or if I discussed in detail in the first video, but the T wave is where you have the repolarization, and there's kind of two parts to that. So I'll draw it in over to the right. If we've got a T wave, it'll be this first part right here where it's starting. That is called an absolute refractory period. And in absolute refractory, it cannot generate another impulse, it cannot depolarize again. But then, once it gets up here, it begins this part, which is the relative refractory period. And in the relative refractory period, if there's a strong enough stimulation, it can generate an impulse, or it can depolarize. So what that means, excuse me, what that means as far as afib is it kind of makes it persist, or it can just make it not really correct on its own. Sometimes it might, but the reason for that is we have we'll say it's over here, we have a random irritable cell in the atria, fires over there. And remember, when it fires, it spreads to all the surrounding cells, and that's how the impulse spreads throughout the atria. So that'll fire in every direction to the surrounding cells, and those will then depolarize. But then what will happen is when the normal impulse comes along, that will hit all these ones that have just depolarized, so all this area won't be able to. So it'll just stop there, and the impulse will continue as normal. But then it starts getting ready to fire again, and once these cells over in this area are getting ready to fire again, or they've gotten to either the relative refractory or they're fully repolarized, they're going to be expecting another beat, but all these other cells have just depolarized, so they're not ready for that yet. So then that causes these cells to, once again, use automaticity, and then that kind of starts to throw things off. And so it's a weird imbalance. Another way, which probably would make a little more sense and probably a more common way, is just there's so much irritability in the atria that multiple places fire kind of at the same time. So you have one firing there at the same time, you have one firing there, and another one firing there, and then maybe a normal impulse for a second or so. But then if you think about all the areas that will be depolarized and in either absolute refractory or relative, it's going to be very off with each other. It's not going to be that normal one direction flow that it's used to. So that'll mean that, say over in this area, it's ready for another beat, but over here is not. So then this area starts firing and spreading, and then it reaches this area, it's not ready. Then this area is expecting some, so it starts firing. And then this area is all of a sudden ready, but this area is not, so then this area starts firing. What that does is eventually it's just all these erratic beats like this throughout the atria. And the end result is it causes the atria to quiver, so the atria will just be doing this instead of actually beating in a manner that circulates blood well, which, if you remember in the first video, we talked about how the atria are just collecting areas and gravity takes care of most of the work for getting the blood down into the ventricles. That is the case, so it's not a lethal rhythm, at least in its own. So like the same thing happens in the ventricles, which we'll talk about in the ventricular rhythm video. That is a lethal rhythm. That is cardiac arrest because the ventricles pump blood. So if that isn't pumping correctly, we don't have circulation of blood and we go into cardiac arrest. The atria, however, because they rely, or because it's mostly just gravity, that quivering, it just causes a less effective or not effective atrial kick, which is just the impulse afterwards that just gets the rest of the blood down into the ventricles. We lose that, or we have it decreased. And so the risk that comes with that is there's might be some blood that doesn't get pumped down into the ventricles because there's not an effective atrial kick. And blood, if it's not constantly circulating, it begins to coagulate or form clots. So say that we have, just like this little bit of blood right here that's still left. And it kind of stays stagnant because it's not getting pumped out effectively. Well, then what happens is, or what can happen is, make this in blue. get a little clot that forms from that decreased movement of the blood, from it just kind of pooling there. And that clot eventually can end up falling down into the ventricles, or the right ventricle here. Then the heart beats, and it'll go up, and either to the left or to the right lung, where, if you remember when we talked about cardiovascular anatomy, the pulmonary artery going to the lungs will then go down into smaller blood vessels, which then will go into capillaries for oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. Those capillaries are so small that they can only have single file cells going through them, so they're microscopic. And when this clot this big goes into a microscopic area, or tries to, it's not going to work. It's going to get stuck. And that's what we call pulmonary embolism, which is basically the same thing as a heart attack, but in your lungs. So that, if untreated and if big enough, that's fatal. So that's our concern there. If the same thing happens, but on the left side, we have a clot that just fell down into here from the left atrium. When it gets pumped out, there's two possibilities. There's two that are going to be concerning to us, very concerning. First, and most likely, is that's going to pump that clot up and into your brain. And the same thing, it gets those capillaries, this thing right here, this big clot, that's going to get lodged somewhere, and that will cause a stroke. Because that's what a stroke is. It's a blood clot in a blood vessel in the brain. At least that's one type of stroke. You can have a heart attack from that, but we'll discuss in later videos. And we kind of did, I think, in the first video, how circulation in the heart works. It's retrograde circulation, so blood pumps up, and as it falls back down, it falls back into the vessels that go to the heart and fills those. So the chances of a clot getting pumped up, falling back down, and perfectly going into one of those vessels is pretty small. It's possible, but unlikely. But the big concern is stroke, and that can definitely happen and is very likely to happen if that clot does get pumped. So atrial fibrillation itself is not a fatal rhythm. The rhythm isn't going to kill you, but it's that clot that gets formed by the stagnant blood that, if it gets pumped out, it can cause fatal conditions. So, and that's in this video, we're not as concerned. It's just, I figured that it's a good thing to understand, and it's an interesting thing that happens. So that's why I talked about it. But this course is mainly just to be able to interpret the rhythms. It's not as much into that pathophys side of understanding, or in depth at least, what's going on. But that one I felt was worth mentioning. But to summarize atrial fibrillation, it's just different pacemaker sites trying to fire at once, which result in the atria quivering. So now let's look at one of those tracings and break it down. So in this, if we remember the criteria that was mentioned, we have an irregular rhythm. So let's go through with our steps that we normally go through for interpreting an EKG, and I'll write them to the right over here. So our first one is regularity. Alright, so our intervals. There, 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 and there. I'll do it on this one too, just because these are easier to see. So, is that regular? From there to there, there to there, there to there, there to there, and there to there? No, not at all. So, this is an irregular rhythm. Oh, turn that light back on. So, nope. Let's calculate the rate now, and with all, or with, I guess not with all. So with atrial fibrillation, we can't use the dark line method of counting because it's never going to be regular. It's possible that, I guess, for a little tracing, you might just be lucky enough to have some beats that just happen to be at regular intervals, but you know, that would just be chance, because this is an irregular rhythm, so it's going to be irregular. So we have to just count the QRSs and multiply by 10, and this is a 6-second strip, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we got a heart rate of 60. And then our next step would be P waves. So one thing with this, do we have P waves? It might look like it, and a lot of people probably think, oh, it's just a lot of P waves, but not really. Because again, it's that irregular firing that's just quivering, so what it's picking up is this quivering. So those aren't a bunch of P waves, it's just atrial quivering. And the reason I say it that way is because they're not P waves that are generating an organized, purposeful contraction of the atria. So therefore, these aren't really P waves. It's just a bunch of disorganized junk going on. So P waves, no, none, no discernible P waves. And then next, we're going to want to check our intervals. I'm not going to write that whole word out. I'm just going to say int. So PR interval, none, because we don't have P waves. So we can't measure a PR interval because we don't know where the P wave starts because there is none. So no PRI. How about our QRS? So this we can measure because your QRSs aren't affected because it's just the atria quivering. Everything from the AV node and below is functioning normally, usually. So we can measure that. So let's go with I think we'll just go with this, the third one on lead 2. So it looks like it starts like right there. Now where's our J point? If you remember when we looked at J points in the last video, we have our S wave coming down, and then it comes back up to baseline, and when it first goes horizontally from there, that'll be our J point. And you'll also see, you can't in this because it's a small tracing, but you'll see the line start to get thicker right where the J point is. So on this one it would be right about there. So that looks like, I'd say about 4, yeah, 4, I don't know, 1, no, I guess about 3, actually, 3 small boxes. So that is equal to 0.12 seconds. So that is on the border of being wide, but that's still within normal range for a QRS, because we want it to be 3 small boxes or less, or 0.12 seconds or less, which it is. All right, and now we can name the rhythm, because when we checked for P waves, we checked to see if there were extra or missing ones, and then had there been ones present, we would have checked to see if there's sinus in nature, but we don't have any, so all that stuff we don't do. So then, in this case, all we'd have to do after getting or regularity and rate in determining that there's no discernible P waves is just check our intervals, which we can't check PRI because there isn't one. So all we would have to check is QRS, and then based on that, we can go ahead and name our rhythm. So in this case, due to that, the undiscernible P waves, this would be afib. And if you remember what we were talking about at the beginning of this rhythm, is this going to be controlled or uncontrolled? This will be controlled. Why? Because it is less than 100 beats per minute. So we'd refer to this as afib controlled. Whoops. Controlled. God, it's been a long shift. Controlled. Alright. In fact, it has been such a long shift that I can't remember if I already told you this, probably, but I'm going to say it again. I am, if you couldn't tell, at work right now. So there is a very good chance that we may not make it through this whole video without me needing to leave. I'll try and pause the video and we'll come back to it once I'm back, but just know that that might happen, which really it doesn't affect you anyway, because for you it'll seem like a split second and I'll be back, but just in case I have to stop talking in like the middle of a sentence and then all of a sudden I'm back, that's why. So let's check out the dynamic cardiology of AFib. See all that just random, not really organized atrial activity, just a bunch of gunky, scribbly stuff. All right, a flutter. And I'm going to plug my computer in just in case. So a flutter, it's kind of like afib, except the difference is we actually do have discernible P waves. It's just there's going to be extra ones. There's going to be more P waves than there are QRS complexes. So there can be, it can be regular. It can also be irregular. It just kind of depends. And it can be with a certain ratio, or it can be what we call a variable response. So a flutter at a certain ratio, it'll mean that there's, say we have a 3-to-1 A flutter, that means there's 3 P waves per QRS. Variable response means we look at it, maybe there's 2, then maybe there's 4, then maybe there's 1, then maybe 2, then maybe 6. Like there's not a specific number, and that's called a variable response, or A flutter with variable ventricular response. So with this, there are, how I said, there are P waves. So the atrial kick is still there. The main problem in a flutter, as opposed to afib, where there's just disorganized depolarization and therefore disorganized beating of the atria or circulation of blood. With atrial flutter, the issue is, the issue is that the atria are firing too fast, and if the ventricles were to try and keep up with that pace, it could put us at a dangerously fast heart rate. So what it does is it blocks some of those rhythms, or some of those electrical impulses. So if it sees a beat like super fast of P waves, it's going to block them, and that's why you'll sometimes get that ratio response, because it'll say, I'm only going to let 1 of every 4 of these through, so that way we can keep the heart beating at a safe rate. So the AV node, kind of how it acts as the gateway to the ventricles, it will stop them, and it'll say only so many can come through every however many beats. Or there can be the variable response where just randomly it'll let some through, but its job is to keep the ventricles from trying to hold the same pace as the atria, because that could be fatal depending on what it is. And it's commonly referred to as a flutter. Cool. And let's talk real quick actually. And there's a saw wave or sawtooth appearance. And that's the morphology for a atrial P wave. And we're gonna talk about that more, and I'll show you more here in the next slide. So let's break down a atrial flutter rhythm. Oh, nope, sorry, first, physiology of a flutter. So it's exactly what I talked about already. The SA node is not the pacemaker in this case. It could be anywhere in the atria, but it's not like just all of them at once like this, causing a quivering. I mean, you might have the first one over here and another one close, but usually it'll be kind of actually in the same area. And the reason for that, or the reason we can tell that, is because there will be monomorphic appearance to the P waves, and they'll have what atrial P waves look like. So atrial P waves tend to be tall and pointy like this, the sawtooth like we're talking about, or sometimes they can be notched, so like that. And pretty much any weird morphology of P waves is going to be an atrial rhythm, because that's always what P waves represent, is atrial depolarization. So any weird variation is going to be an atrial rhythm. It just tells you more where they're coming from. So like these peaked ones, these tall ones there, those are usually more associated with the right atria. So you're going to see those in rhythms that involve the right atria, whereas these ones are more associated with the left atria. So you're going to see that notched appearance more commonly there. But there's all kinds of different variations that it could be, and if it's not that regular sinus P wave like this, where it's upright, round, and symmetrical, then you know it's an atrial P wave. So, and we'll talk about the P wave morphology and what that means as far as location in the advanced course once I make that. So, yeah, so let's say we have an impulse being fired at about here-ish. In that general area is where the pacemaker site is. It took over for the SA node, which is not working in this case, or not firing. So let's say that this area here is firing P waves at a rate of 300 beats per minute. The AV node knows that 300 is way too fast, and that's not a survivable rate, so we will go into cardiac arrest and die if it does that. So it might say that I'm only going to let one out of every 3 through. So one comes up, doesn't let it through. Second one comes up, doesn't let it through. This one comes up, boom, not through. And then eventually another one comes along and it does let it through. And so instead of having a rate of 300, it may have reduced the rate and kept it at 100, which is absolutely a survivable rate for us. So that's just another one of the interesting ways that the heart keeps us safe and has fail-safes in case other things stop functioning properly. Alright, so hopefully I wasn't in the middle of a sentence, because for now, like the 3rd time in a row, I just skipped to the next slide, and for some reason it doesn't let you go back, so you just have to skip all the way through every slide, and it puts a video on every slide then. So you have to delete those and come back and start over from that slide. So I've done this slide like 3 times now, and So I don't remember where I was back when I was doing this correctly in the last slide. I don't know what's happening, but so I was writing a bunch of stuff and kind of taking probably too long to explain this slide, so we're going to try and avoid that in case I do it again. I'm going to write less stuff except for when necessary. So sorry about that, even though you guys probably wouldn't know because it's a very quick thing, but man, it is a pain. So let's just go through, break down atrial flutter here, and we'll use V2 for some of this because it'll be easier. So first thing, we need to determine regularity, just like with any other rhythm. So from here to here to here to here, it looks regular to me, so it is regular. We're going to need to calculate the rate, which would be good to do from this one. So if we count dark lines, 300, 150, 100, so it's just below 100. So like high 90s. Now P waves, are they present? Yes. Are there any missing ones? Nope. Are there extra ones? Yes. See, like this one, and this one, then this one, this one. Those don't have a QRS after them, so those are extra ones. So yes, we have extra P waves. Are they monomorphic? If we look down at this one, this lead on the bottom, and really any of them, they all look the same. So yes, monomorphic, so that means they're coming from the same pacemaker or the same general area of the atria. And so now we're going to determine, even though we already know what this is, and I just said that that means it's coming from the same part of the atria, but just for getting in good habits, since in real life we won't know what this is right away, or we might not, at least, we need to really get used to those steps of interpretation and practice them. So we've identified there's P waves and there are extra ones that are monomorphic. So are these sinus P waves? Let's run through the steps of that. So are they upright? Yes. Are they round? No, because if we look at this bottom lead, see how pointy those are? And I said in other videos, sometimes that's not a big deal, and that's true. It just takes some practice to get used to what is kind of within normal that might look abnormal for sinus waves and what is abnormal. And this is not sinus, you can just tell with experience. They're just too tall, too pointy. It's not sinus. So then we automatically know, because it's P waves, that it's atrial, because P waves represent atrial depolarization. So if there are P waves, that means that it has to be in the atria, whether that be somewhere randomly in the atria or whether that's the sinoatrial node. But we've just determined it is not the sinoatrial node, so that means it must just be somewhere random in the atria, but in the same general area, because it is monomorphic or has the same characteristics each P wave.
Flight Hawk Medic 2, Ill Travel.
Thought we were going out on a call.
Medic 2.
So
We are clear, Lutheran and head of X County. Copy, state travels 2110.
So these are atrial P waves, or these are not from the sinus node, we know they're from somewhere in the atria in the same general area. Our rate is just below 100, and we have a regular rhythm. Now what we're going to do is check our intervals. So let's come down to this bottom one again, and from right here to the beginning of the QRS, it'll be our PR interval. So let's count that, and that's going to be about 4 small boxes, so 0.16 seconds, if I did that right. Yep. Sorry guys, it's been a long shift and it's late, and yeah, so the old brain's not doing the math so well. But yeah, 0.16 seconds, so PR interval is normal. How about QRS? I personally can't see that small of a thing. It's like, at most it's like 0.08, but it might be like 0.04 even, so it's narrow, pretty narrow QRS complex, so but still normal. It's less than 3 small boxes, or 0.12 seconds, so that's good. And based on that, now we can determine what rhythm this is. So these all have that sharp sawtooth appearance. So we would call this a flutter or atrial flutter. This one is going to be a one that's a ratio because, again, looking at this bottom one, because those give us the best P waves to look at. Got 1, 2, 3, then one there. Now 1, 2, 3. However, if we look in this T wave, that's not a normal shape for a T wave, so I think there's actually going to be P waves within that T wave from the next part, because remember, in atrial flutter, there's a rapid atrial impulse or rate, and it's the AV node's job to only let some of those through to actually make the ventricles conduct the electricity and beat. So there's just this real fast rate, and by the ventricles letting some through every now and then, we are going to have some that end up in the T wave sometimes like this. So if we look like right in this one, that little peak there, if you notice, I'll try and draw it here with yellow, it looks very similar, this little point there, to these other points. And if you look in the other T waves and you look at that first little point and compare it to the other P waves, you'll notice that same morphology or that same characteristic. So that's what makes me think that there is a P wave within that T wave. And measurement wise, from PP interval, so like there to there, about the same distance ish to around there. So yeah, those are probably P waves. So it would be easy to call this a flutter with 3-to-1 conduction, but because of that very likely P wave and the T wave, we're going to call this atrial flutter with 4-to-1 conduction ratio. So hopefully that's making some sense and you can understand why I'm calling it a 4-to-1 instead of a 3-to-1. And I've got to turn that on again. Alright, let's move on to the next one. I'm glad we actually made it through this one after 3 tries of me accidentally skipping too far. Oh, and there's the dynamic cardiology above. So look at those T waves, just so you can really see what I'm talking about with there being a P wave within there. Those tips look exactly like the P waves, so that's why I say 4-to-1. Okay, wandering atrial pacemaker. So with wandering atrial pacemaker, WAP, or WAP, what that is unlike atrial flutter, which we just talked about, that has all of these atrial impulses coming from either like the same or like around the same area in the atria, wandering atrial pacemaker, instead, with each beat, it's switching to a different place within the heart, and different places are going to give different appearances to that P wave. So we're going to talk about that a little bit in the next slide, when we go over the physiology of wandering atrial pacemaker. But the rules for it, there must be present P waves. There will be varying morphology in those P waves, so it'll be polymorphic P waves. Maybe upright or downward depending on where they are, which also we'll talk about in the next slide. And it will be an irregular rhythm. So here's the physiology behind it. And we're actually talking about 2 rhythms in this one, but I'll get to that in a second. So wandering atrial pacemaker. If we have an impulse, say, that generates right here, that's pretty close to the SA node, which is right there. So that is actually going to generate a fairly similar P wave to those of sinus P waves, because it's pretty close, and the whole shape of the P waves depends on where it is in the heart and what direction it has to go to depolarize the atria. So you may see that if it's really close to the sinoatrial node, although it's not a sinus rhythm. Now, generally with the right atrium, the abnormality in morphology tends to be more peaked looking, so those tend to be kind of more like that if they're coming from the right atrium. They're going to be more pointy and tall, or they might be kind of more that way or like that. And then P waves that come from the left atrium are more likely to have like an M shape to them, like this. So there will be what we call a notch, which is these in the tops. So it'll be kind of normal. You have a little notch, and then it'll come down. And it goes up, a little notch, and down. And that's usually left atrium P waves, are kind of like that, but there can be all kinds of variations and different morphologies to those. But those are just kind of somewhat more common that you might see, especially in a certain condition called hypertrophy of the atria, which we'll talk about in the advanced EKG lesson. But it can be any type of morphology. Just know that that's kind of the M-ish shape is more left, and the tall, peaked, narrower ones are more right-sided atrial rhythms or atrial P waves. So now we're gonna talk about something called retrograde conduction, which I don't think I covered in the first video, which I should have. But what is important to remember is that the whole heart still needs to beat, so all the cells still need to depolarize, even if the pacemaker site falls somewhere below where it would normally be. So for instance, if we have an impulse that generates, let's say like right here, it will come this way and down and up to the ventricles as it should. But that doesn't mean that this whole area up here just doesn't get depolarized. It still needs to do that. So what happens is at the same time that this impulse is shooting downwards, it also sends impulses back through those internodal pathways in cells, like so. And it depolarizes the atria that way. And so that reverse direction, is what we refer to as retrograde. So retrograde conduction just means reverse conduction. And if we recall all the way back to the very first lesson on what makes a positive deflection or a negative deflection on a EKG tracing, it's again the direction of electrical flow. So down here, our left leg, we have a positive lead. Up here, our right arm is a negative lead. And normally our vector or overall direction of flow of electricity is kind of in that way. So because when the P waves, or when the electricity goes through the atria and the internodal pathways like this, the vector is that way. So it's going at this positive electrode. Therefore, that's why it creates a positive P wave like this. Now, when we have that low atrial pacemaker site, such as right here, and we get that retrograde conduction, then the electricity is going from a positive towards a negative, which instead causes a negative deflection. So sometimes you'll hear people say that some P waves look like a low atrial pacemaker. That means like basically anywhere down like in here, that's where they think the impulse is coming from, and the reason they think that is because of this negative deflection. Because when it's low like this, it has to rely on that retrograde conduction to depolarize the atria, which causes a reverse direction of the flow of electricity, which will cause that negative P wave. So if we see negative P waves, that means it's a low atrial pacemaker site. And so with WAP, wandering atrial pacemaker, say where our first beat is up here, that complex or that cardiac cycle, the P wave will look like this, and then you'll have your QRS as normal, T wave, and then say for the next one, it fires over here somewhere. You might see this. And say the third one is over here. You might see this. And then say the last one is here. You might see this. So if you notice, if I circle the P waves of each one, notice the difference in morphology. That tells us that the pacemaker site in the atria is moving around or wandering. So that's why it's called wandering atrial pacemaker. And that's how we identify it, is by those different morphologies of P waves. And this rhythm will generally be irregular as well. So let's break it down. I pretty much explained everything in that last one that we need to cover. So let's just go through the steps. Is this rhythm regular? Let's check RR intervals. So no, because like right here, it's kind of close, but then right there is a little longer. So it's not very irregular, but it is irregular. So no, this is not a regular rhythm. So this is a 6-second strip though, so let's count how many, or count our heart rate. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So this person's heart rate is at about 120 and irregular. So do we have P waves? Yes. Do we have one before every QRS complex? Hard to say on some of them, but maybe. Do we have any missing ones or extra ones? No. And that's another thing about wandering atrial pacemaker. You will have a QRS complex for every P wave. So we should not see any extra ones. There should be one for every QRS. And in this case there is, it's just, or there's no extra ones at least, because they're there in some cases. Like if it is, the impulse is really close to the AV node, remember it goes both ways at the same time. So you might only see like a tiny little glimpse of the P wave before the QRS starts, and then that will overpower the P wave activity, so you won't see it. So like in this one, see that little tiny like notch right there? That's probably the very beginning of a P wave, and then the QRS comes and drowns it out, so you don't see it. So in this one, it does look like there is a P wave for every QRS, although it's hard to see, but there are no extra ones, which is a big part of that. So yes, P waves are present, no extra missing ones from what we can tell. Are these sinus P waves? No, they're not monomorphic. And look at this one, very pointed. That one's pretty pointed. So these do not have a sinus morphology to them. They're very abnormal. So no, these are not sinus P waves. Just check our intervals, which should be fairly consistent. So it's a little over, it's about 5. And it can, I should say, it can be sometimes like a little varying, but for the most part it'll be about the same, but it all depends on where that P wave is. So this one, these PR intervals are super short because it's really close to the AV node. But then on some of the ones like this one, it's going to be longer. And that's kind of also what gives it its irregularity. It's just how close the P wave is to the to the AV node, which means that the PR interval will be shorter because it has less distance to go before it gets there, and then the ventricular part starts. So yeah, we have a varying PR interval. QRS looks good, and that shouldn't really be affected at all. So yeah, it's about 0.08 seconds, so it's normal. So now we can name the rhythm, and I would call this wandering atrial pacemaker. Let's see the dynamic cardiology to that. Cool. Now, premature atrial complex. This is not a rhythm of its own. This is an ectopic beat that's caused by irritability. So it's just a single beat that comes early from when you'd expect it. It can be sustained for up to like 3 beats or so sometimes, but usually it's just a single one at a time. It might be every other actual beat, or it might be every 3, or it could just be every now and then, just very rarely. But as I put right here, it is not a rhythm of its own. It disrupts the underlying rhythm. It is an ectopic beat that is early, and you have to identify the underlying rhythm. So don't just say, when you go to tell someone what rhythm is, don't just say it's premature atrial complex, because that's not a rhythm. You need to tell them what the rhythm is and say that it has PACs, or premature atrial complexes, in it. Oops. So there's not really much explanation that's needed for PAC, so we're just going straight to breaking it down instead of the physiology. So let's go through our steps. Is this a regular rhythm? Yes. Now, technically no, because see right here, that's not normal. But the reason I say yes is because the actual underlying rhythm, which would be from here to there, and from there to there, and there, that's normal RR intervals. So this is a regular rhythm. So the way I would say it is, it's a regular rhythm that is interrupted by a PAC. Regular underlying rhythm interrupted by a PAC, which is that guy right there. I'm going to circle it. Right there. And see, it has a pretty similar morphology to P waves and overall QRS and everything. It just comes a little early. And it's just that one right there. So let's see, it's like right after this T wave, whoops, right after this T wave goes right into the next thing. So that is what tells me that it's a PAC. And let's see the dynamic cardiology of that, and I will try and point it out to you when it happens. Yeah, probably like that one. Yeah, it's a little tricky. That rhythm I probably made too fast, so it's kind of hard to see, but yeah, so it'd be this guy right here. It just comes early. Now we're going to do some final practice and go over these rhythms. Pause the video here if you need to. I'm going to go through these a little bit fast, just because you can pause the video and you can go through it yourself and see if you're correct. This is like the test for this section, the final test, if you will. So we're not going to explain it too much. We're just going to go through the steps. I'm going to tell you what it is, and you're going to see if you were right or not. And if not, then go back and watch, try and see if you can clarify some things. And if you are right, then you're good to go on. And also, it's pretty late here now, and we're going to be busy tonight probably, so I want to get some sleep before the next call drops. All right, so first one, is it regular? Yes, I think, yeah. It looks pretty regular. Yeah, sure. What's our rate? Rate's about 100-ish. Yeah. Well, yeah, so rate's about 100. Do we have P waves? Yes, we do. Are there extra ones or missing ones? No. Is there one before every QRS? Yes. Jeez, that one's kind of lost in there. So yeah, those are P waves. There's one before every QRS. There's no extra ones. Are they sinus in nature? No, not at all. I mean, look at this one, and look at like that one, and that one. So not at all sinus in nature. What's our PR interval? Well, on this guy, it's about 6 small boxes. So it's like 0.20 to 0.24-ish. So it's a long PR, but then like this one is like right at 5, so it varies, and this one's like none almost. So this first one, with that info, I would call it wandering atrial pacemaker, WAP. All right, next one. Is this a regular rhythm? Sure, looks like it. What's the rate? Let's use this guy right here. 300, 150, 100. So this one's somewhere around like 130 to 135. So fast. We have P waves. They are monomorphic, so they're coming from the same area. However, they are not sinus because although they are upright, they're not very round, although they are symmetrical. So we have that sharp sawtooth appearance, which is indicative of atrial flutter and an atrial rhythm. We've got, looks like one lost in the T there, maybe another one there, there. So I would call this a flutter with 4-to-1 conduction, which I'm not going to write all that out because that would take too long. I even just made an H instead of writing 2 T's. A flutter, 4-to-1. Cool. Then at the bottom here, that is irregular. We have no discernible P waves, so therefore no PRI. QRS is narrow at about 0.08 seconds. And the rate, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 60 to 70, I think my video is in the way of the next one, so it's probably 70, but we'll call it 60, 70. So that's really all we can tell with this, and based on what we have found, this would be considered VFib controlled. AFib controlled because it's under 100 beats per minute. Okay, this one is irregular. The rate would be 1. Rate would be about 12, so 120. We do have discernible P waves, although some are upright, some are not. They are not round, they are not symmetrical, and they are not monomorphic. So based on this, I can say that this is also a WAP, wandering atrial pacemaker. Then this next one below, irregular. The rate is about 90-ish, maybe 100. It's kind of hard to say. See, like it looks like there's P waves there, but I don't know that that's the case. And I can't really tell, so we're going to call this AFib controlled or possibly uncontrolled, depending on what the exact rate is later found to be, I guess. And then this one down here, is it regular? Yes, the rate from here is about 300, 150, 100. It's a little over 100. Alright. And P waves, yep. One before every QRS, yep. Any missing ones or extra ones? Nope. Are they sinus in nature? They are upright. They are, see, this is where experience comes in, because I would actually call these round enough to be considered sinus. So I'd say sinus, and yes, we did. Or, yeah. So I'd call those sinus. They are symmetrical. Yeah, PR interval is 4. PR interval is pretty consistent at about 0.16 seconds. QRS is at about 1.20 or 0.12. So those are all good. So I would call this actually sinus tach. And I am throwing in some rhythms that aren't from the section we're discussing, just to see if you have retained that information, and see if you recognize it, because it's easy to get these right when you know we're talking about atrial rhythms, so you know it's going to be one of like 4 or however many rhythms. It's just a lot easier for you to guess and be right. So by throwing in rhythms from different lessons or previous lessons, that kind of gets you more engaged and keeps you trying to look at all those things, all those criteria more carefully, knowing that it's not a guarantee that just because we're talking about atrial rhythms that I only put atrial rhythms in the test.